So tell me, I'd love to know your first period story. So can you take me all the way back to like where you were, who was around you, what were you doing at the time, how were you feeling? Like paint a picture for me. Like where were you? How old were you? Do you remember?
Yes, I do remember pretty clearly actually. So I was 13. I just started year seven. I wasn't living in this town. I was living in a different town. Um, I was living in it was a really crappy town.
Okay.
Um, so
Why
I
was it
was
crappy?
13.
What was crappy about it? Like why is it crappy?
Well, first of all, it was small and there was nothing to do and it was cold. But I was also really heavily bullied when I was a kid.
Okay.
So I was bullied all through primary school and I was also dealing with some childhood like trauma and stuff like that from just my at-home family life and all of that fun stuff.
Mhm.
So my life wasn't the greatest back then. Um, but so I have a lot of I always had a lot of negative associations with the town that I lived in when I was younger. But so I was 13 and I was at home. It wasn't a school day or anything. And it's a funny thing actually. I had these like how like kids have these like fake vampire fangs and these fake little blood capsules. I was playing around with one of those and I drank something that had the fake blood in it.
Oh.
And I went to the bathroom later and I thought, oh my God, it's like come out. And it was the silliest thing. I was like, oh my God. Deep down, I knew what it actually was, but I was in denial about it. And I was really afraid. I was like, no, I don't want my period. This is awful. So I was like, no, it's just the capsule. Obviously, it wasn't. Um, so that was pretty funny. I had the absolute worst cramps when I first got my period. It was awful. I haven't had bad cramps. I've had really bad cramps maybe like 4 times in total. I'm normally pretty lucky with that sort of thing. And so I had really bad cramps and I don't think I told my mum until the day after. And I remember the night of the day that I got my period. I remember being in bed, just absolutely in agony, crying. It was the worst night ever.
Mm.
And so that was my sort of first experience with that. And I remember telling my mum, and she was like, "Oh, why didn't you tell me?" And I'm just like, "Well, I don't know. I just didn't want to tell you." But yeah, it wasn't. We didn't really talk about. My mum's not a very open person. Like
Mm.
she's not a very open person. And we've never really talked a lot about things. So but she helped me out, did the usual stuff that you do, make sure that I had pads and everything like that, and medication to take for the pain and everything. And I remember being really annoyed about it, like annoyed about having a period. I'd go to school and I'd like have to deal with this, and it was just like there's a lot of angst, and a lot of like, oh, why do girls have to have periods, that kind of stuff. And but you get used to it as you get older. You realize it's like just a normal part of life. But yeah, it wasn't a fun first period. It was pretty bloody awful. But um, yeah, I'm just glad that you know most of my periods go over pretty easy,
Mm.
as opposed to some people who have to get surgeries and all kinds of stuff. So, but yeah, that was the first one, the first
Yeah.
experience.
And do you have any brothers or sisters?
I have a little brother and an older sister, an older half sister. Yeah.
Okay. And was she around you, the older sister, when you got your period?
No, I didn't grow up with her. She grew up with her mum, and our family, we sort of didn't really connect until I was about 16, purely because circumstances, family and stuff that sort of kept us, like I didn't even really know much about her.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't even really meet her until I was like 7 or something. I mean, I had met her, but I didn't remember because I was so little.
Mm-hmm.
But no, we didn't get to grow up together and anything like that. But I did grow up with my brother. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. And how do you think that first period story memory shaped the rest of your journey?
I think I remember being sort of not necessarily directly told, but it's kind of one of those things that you're supposed to keep it under wraps and pretend like it doesn't exist, and you're not allowed to talk about it, and it's very brushed over as sort of like a shameful woman thing.
And sorry,
And I
where did
remember
you get that from? Where did you get that from? From your mom or from the school or from your friends? Like, where did that come from?
it's a combination of things because, when you're at school, when you're in high school, you try to hide when you're taking like your pads out or your tampons out, you try to hide them. Like you see other girls do it. Other girls are like, oh, don't let anyone see it. And that kind of makes you think, oh, okay. And, people don't say the words like menstrual cycle, period, like especially in high school, you're not supposed to say the words. And also just, I remember because I've always been a little bit odd in my family, a little bit outspoken.
Mm-hmm.
So like I just like say things, and everyone would just give me this weird look, including my mum. She'd sort of be like, "Why are you talking about that? Like, what are you doing?" And I was like, "Well, it's normal." And so I sort of just learnt from my environment that it wasn't supposed to be talked about. But I never really it didn't stop me really from like sort of mentioning it or talking about it or being openly like, hey, I need this for my period, or I need pain meds for my period. Like I would just say that, whereas, people would be very secretive, like not telling people when they're on their period, not letting on that they're on their period, that sort of thing. But it's like, well, it is what it is. So
Mm.
it's a lot of influences, and I think society has sort of made women feel ashamed of most things that are relevant to being a woman anyway. So that sort of factors under it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And did you know when your mum was on her period at all?
Well, my mum had a hysterectomy. So she had a hysterectomy after my brother. So I never like she never got her periods after that. So it wasn't really something that she would talk about or that she would have to like deal with anymore. So yeah.
And do you think her attitude towards, like, in general, towards periods and not being open with you has really affected you through your mum, reflecting from your mum?
Um, I wouldn't say so because of the fact that I sort of have always been the sort of person who will shape my own views and opinions and experiences regardless of whether or not they go along with my family's, which has sort of, like I never really mirrored those actions or sort of repeated those cycles and things. So like the behaviors that were sort of, or the attitude towards a lot of things that my parents had, I never really adopted those attitudes.
Yeah.
Um, so I honestly don't think that it really affected me in any other way other than it made me sort of question why it was like sort of a weird topic, especially because, my mum's a nurse, so she has seen some
Oh,
things, she's been around some
wow.
things.
She's
So,
a
and
nurse.
she's not grossed out by periods or anything. It was more of just like she was sort of taken aback at how openly I would sort of talk about it,
Mm.
like I talk about um like I often talk about how people don't talk about it. I'd be like, oh, why don't people talk about their periods? It's just blood, it's just normal, it's just this. And she would recognize the discomfort, I think, in from my brother and my dad, and she would then be like, oh, what are you doing? So I think it was more so just like not necessarily that she in herself is sort of uncomfortable with it, but more of just like it's expected that, you don't talk about it around like guys or
Yeah.
men.
Yeah.
But I suppose it's like a lot of men talk about weird stuff around everyone, you know? So they're not really ashamed of much. So it's, yeah, it was sort of like, even just the word period, like people get weirded out about the word, but it's not a weird word. It's just the word for it. So, but no, I don't really think it did much shaping for me.
Okay. And what about your mum's upbringing? Like, have you looked into that? Like, do you think she wasn't allowed to be, or not allowed to be, but it wasn't open with her mother to talk about these things either?
Um, in general, their relationship was very strained. So there wasn't much openness between them from what I know. In regards to periods and that, I haven't really looked into it, but my kind of guess and assumption would be that what I do know is that my mum was often told to like toughen up and that kind of thing, and like sort of not really have, like if she was having a bad cramp or a really bad day, like she would have to go to school anyway. Like there wasn't much room for her to express the natural things that are expressed during the cycle. And a lot of women, especially before today's society, like weren't really allowed, like didn't look into it, didn't
Yeah.
really sort of understand it as fully as women in today's society in this generation
Mm.
sort of do. So I think she would have been unable to do what I am able to do, which is to learn about the cycle and sync up with it, and be okay with resting when I want to rest, be okay with being energized when I'm energized.
Mm.
Um, so I think her relationship with um, her cycle probably would have been more of a sort of traditional sort of relationship with it, in terms of there's no real like connection, there's no real sort of, it just is something
That
that
happens.
it's like just a physical thing. She wouldn't have had any spiritual sort of connection to it, or she wouldn't have looked into it. It would have been just like I'm not allowed to complain about it, I'm not allowed to talk about it, it's something I've got to be embarrassed about. And that was probably reinforced, in her childhood and stuff like that. So
Mm.
yeah.
Yeah. And when you look at your mom, can she take rest periods for herself, do you think? Can she like look after herself and be kind to herself? Like, did you see that growing up with her?
um
I know she wasn't on it,
she's
she didn't have a period, but could she still like do nice things for herself and be in the feminine flow type of thing?
she's really quite and like disconnected from her femininity, I suppose, like her in terms of her ability to allow herself to flow and to rest and to be kind and to be gentle with herself and expressive. She has a lot of walls, and a lot of guard kind of up, and she doesn't often allow herself the time to be gentle with herself.
Mhm.
And that's partly due to her upbringing. A lot of people are like that because of their upbringing and society, but mostly, upbringing and stuff like that. So she's not very in tune with what her body and her mind are telling her. Um, and I just feel like she doesn't think she's ever doing enough, or that she's ever working sort of like nothing's ever sort of good enough. So I don't think she's connected to it in that way. She has felt the pull though to be more connected with herself.
Mm-hmm.
It's just she hasn't embarked on that journey as of yet.
Mm-hmm. And have you been able to rest and take care of yourself when you're on your period, do you feel? Or when did that start for you, when when you've been able to look within and go, I need rest now. I need to be kind to myself. When do you think that journey started for you?
Um, it's when I started being kind to myself, it was only really like half a year to a year ago when I started being kind to myself and allowing myself to be and exploring my needs and my emotions. And um I've never in the past, over most of my life, and I'm only 20, so like 3/4 of my life,
Yeah.
um have been there's been a lot of self hatred and disallowing myself to sort of exist.
Mhm.
Um, but in recent times, I've really come to sort of realize that I need to commit to myself before anything else and let myself live as a human being. And I think of myself sort of like it's a mix between sort of thinking of myself as my own child in a way, like nurturing the part of me that is a child, nurturing my inner child, nurturing my inner teenager, to like rehabilitate them and take care of them, whilst also like as I'm going into adulthood, reminding myself that yes, you know, I will need to work hard to achieve what I want and work in the working world, to make a living. And you know, but that's my cat wheezing. I don't know if you can hear that.
Not really.
But she's quite loud. But I'm sort of learning to, you know, push myself when I need to push myself, but let myself rest. So it sort of started very recently.
Mhm.
But, you know, I suppose it is good that it started now, because I am only like, I'm on year one of adulthood. So it's good that it started now as opposed
Yeah.
to when I'm like, you know, 50 or something. And yeah, but
Yeah.
it's never too late to sort of start taking care of yourself and like letting yourself go with the flow and all of that. So yeah.
Mm. And so how do you think your mom has shaped your femininity?
Um, I think the relationship between my me and femininity has always been, um and when I say like femininity, I'm talking sort of about like the energy of femininity that everyone has, and
Mhm.
the intuition and openness and all of that. Like I've struggled to keep, I've always been naturally open and naturally kind and naturally generous, but very many things have sort of imposed on that nature that I've got, and sort of threatened to sort of withdraw me into more of a masculine energy, more of a work work hard to achieve things, sort of like if you can't have, you know, if you can't be intuitive and gentle and kind, then you may as well be strong and independent. And um, independence is something I had to learn for myself, purely because of my relationship with my parents.
Mhm.
I had to be very independent because my emotional needs were never met.
Mhm.
And so my femininity and that softness and that gentleness was absent from my life up until about a year ago, when I gave it to myself, when I gave myself permission to sort of be more feminine because my parents lack sort of a in touch and with their energy of softness and gentleness and intuition, and they're both very, stuck in the whole divine masculine sort of, as opposed to the divine feminine. And yeah, I feel like they sort of made me realize that I needed to, without intentionally doing it, they sort of pushed me further into myself. So that, and I ended up kind of alchemizing my experiences, like turning them into something I could sort of foster for myself. Like it sort of happened naturally. So I'm trying to think of how to word this properly. Yeah, they're just, they sort of taught me, without directly saying it, they sort of taught me that all of the characteristics of femininity in itself and divine femininity are wrong. So sensitivity, following your intuition instead of using logic in your brain, like allowing yourself to be more focused on connection and family instead of objects and money and cars, and because they've always tried to get things, and valued sort of that sort of thing the most. So I sort of learned that those things were seen as bad, but eventually I was like, nah, that's not how it is. That's not how it's supposed to be. And so I taught myself how to value those things more.
Okay.
Or at least maybe not more, but equally, so that there's equilibrium between the divine masculine and divine feminine sort of energies a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that was very interesting to hear. And what are some of the feminine activities that you do in your everyday life? Like, could be anything from the books you read, the videos you watch, from whatever it means to you.
I think connecting to my intuition and disconnecting from sort of what is going to work in the real, like, physical world, and more so what's going to work in my internal world. So connecting to my intuition instead of, it's sort of like head and heart sort of thing. And it's not to say that there's no logic in femininity, because there is, but it's more heart-based, I think.
Yeah.
Well, I say that, but like they're both heart-based, and they're both head-based at the same time. But I think one is more involving the wisdom that comes from the feelings that you feel, and one is more from a place of, how does this work in the physical sort of world?
Yeah.
So connecting to my intuition by sort of just listening to, it's hard to explain, but sort of just listening to the internal voice, as opposed to the voice that says, how is this going to, like, what's constructive, what's going to work, like, are these feelings going to help you get from point A to point B? Like, are these feelings going to help you work harder, or are they going to, instead of thinking of it like that, I'm like, well, are these feelings true to me? Are these feelings understandable to me? Are these feelings, because sometimes feelings aren't beneficial, or they can't be used as like a cog in the machine. They just simply are. So that's sort of one of them, is connecting to those feelings and realizing that I don't have to turn them into something that I can, like, use as a fuel to sort of push me further in the world. And then another thing I think would be practicing openly loving people without fearing that it's going to make me too vulnerable. Even though loving certain people can be quite difficult and quite painful, it's important to keep the heart open, because closing it is never going to be healthy for anyone.
Yeah.
And I think that's a very soft sort of aspect to people that we all have the capacity to tap into, but some of us aren't vulnerable enough. So vulnerability is another thing that I try to practice, just in day-to-day life, just remembering not to be surrounded by those walls. And also I think creativity is a very sort of divine feminine sort of trait, like an aspect of it. It's creativity and just creation in any sort of form.
Yeah.
So I like to create I like to create poetry out of my life, like poetry out of my experiences. Everything that I have been through and experienced, I can turn into some sort of written story that's like in some way like it brings all of these epiphanies and these like poetic like meanings behind it, and seeing the world from the perspective of a creator and of a writer and of a poet, instead of seeing the world as a factory or a sort of a war or a something to win or achieve and conquer. I sort of like to see the world with more sort of, I guess, like a graceful way, like see it in more of a graceful way. And I think that's an inherently feminine thing, to sort of stop and admire the deep, meaningful aspects of life and the beautiful things in life instead of running past them all.
Yeah. Amazing. And do you feel like you channel the poetry? Does it just come through you, like when you're in that space?
It just comes to me in day-to-day life. Like I'll be minding my own business, thinking about things, and I'll stop and I'll be like, I have to write that down. And I'll write that down because I'm always thinking sort of from the perspective of it's almost like I'm written out, like my personality and the way I think of things is almost the same as a fictional character. It's always a lot more complex and deep and dramatic sometimes than, real life necessarily like should be. I sort of feel like I belong in some sort of like old poetic movie or something, because I'm always thinking like that. I'm always writing like that. I'm always feeling like that. And it does just hit me in my everyday life. Like I could be deep in thought while on the way to work and I'll be like, okay, I have to stop and write this down.
Yeah.
Or I'll have an experience and I'll find some sort of deep meaning to it. And it can be exhausting living like that because there's a lot of heaviness that can come with depth, but at the same time it's like the most rich way to live, to see the world in such a meaningful, beautiful sort of way. Like I feel like it's nice to have that ability. And I don't think it's very common for people to be constantly seeing the world as like a storybook, and it does factor into my, sometimes I am prone to like escapism and trying to escape by thinking of things in a sort of fantasy like way. but the majority of it is me taking life and life's lessons and life's hardships and life's trials and turning them into something beautiful. And it could be a survival mechanism that I developed, but I think it's a good thing a lot of the time. Yeah.
Yeah, it's great that you have that process when it is coming through, that you can really, yep, stop and it's coming through. And I'm going like, that's what, like, all amazing writers have done. Like, and they all, like, they got the tape recorder as well and they record their notes
Yeah.
with the ideas there. So yeah, I love that
Yeah.
process. Wow, how connected. When did that start, that process? That always been with you or just recently again?
I think it's always been with me. Um, I think like I've always felt things very deeply. I've always been deeply in tune with um emotions and always had big deep feelings.
Mm.
Because I can't feel anything in a shallow sense. Like none of my feelings can be sort of, I guess, easy or shallow. They always have to be like deep wells of that lead me down into other deep wells. Like I've got a very complex brain for me to work out, but I think it really, really started to really come out in the last literally in the last like 2 years. That's when I really started to connect with writing even more and connect with my feelings and sort of start to shift and change and transmute sort of everything into, it's sort of like taking stone and turning it into gold, because I think when I can take hardships and lessons and bad things and sort of find out how I can make them sort of meaningful and how they actually work into my life. That all sort of started to happen over the last 2 years. Yeah. So it's quite recent, but I feel like I've always had the capacity.
Yeah.
It's just never been fully implicated into my life until the last 2 years. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you have any dreams of getting married and having a family yourself?
No, I haven't really had. I actually distinctly over my life have been distinctly like really, really, as even as a young kid, I've always been really, really against all of that
Yeah.
for myself personally. I grew up as very much stubborn in the idea of like I'm not having kids. And in a way that is sort of like, you know, um, partly because I was always rejecting my femininity as a kid, like more so in a sense of being seen as girly. Like I always rejected that as a kid. But I also just felt that kids and that sort of side of life was always very like it took away a lot of freedom.
Mm-hmm.
So my views on having children, I think, partly are to do with, I think, some past lives of because I believe in reincarnation and past lives and all of that sort of stuff. So
Yeah.
for me, with my belief system around that, I've done some past life work.
Mm-hmm.
I've had some past lives where I have been in situations as a woman where I have sort of been in that position where I've had to have children and been either too young or it's just been expected of me and it took away a lot of my freedom.
Yeah.
And so in this life, and I think that's part of the reason why now in this life, I'm like, I've always, ever since I was little, I've always been like, no, I'm never having kids. But as I got older, it became less about like being stubborn and not wanting to have kids just because I said so, but more so just because it's just not something that I want. It's
Mhm.
just not something that I have ever wanted or ever really felt connected to. Um, I actually have sort of always been afraid of kids. It might sound weird, but sometimes they're just very brutally honest and a little bit scary. Um, but recently I've sort of been a little bit more open to being around kids, not necessarily having my own kids, but being around kids, because I think kids can be quite wise sometimes in what they say and just how they live so honestly.
Mhm.
Um, and I have a niece and nephew that are only 2,
Okay.
um, and so they're my sister's 2 kids,
Mhm.
and they sort of helped me become more comfortable with children.
Yeah.
Just sort of when I go to see them, I notice that like I actually am excited to see them and spend time with them, and yeah. So I've never wanted my own children.
Mhm.
And as for marriage, it was the same when I was little. The same with marriage. I was like, I'm not getting married, and my grandma would be like, "You're gonna change your mind," and I was like, "No." um, but now it's more so. I don't feel like it's something that I have to do.
Mhm.
Um, but I'm also not like opposed to it. I
Mhm.
just feel like, you know, I I've it's hard to see marriage being an option for me when I haven't even been on a date in my life, so
Yeah.
it's hard to sort of see that in my life. But it's not something I'm against or opposed to whereas with children, I know I'm not going to have children.
Yeah.
um I'm more of a cat person. I'll just have lots of cats. Yeah,
All your fur babies. They'll be your fur babies. What's your
yeah.
cat's name? What's your cat's name?
So I have Rebel
Rebel?
and Lily. Yeah,
Lily? Yeah. So you have
Lily
two.
and Rebel. Yeah, yeah.
Lovely. And with all this work you're doing on your feminine attraction, when you dive into the feminine, you can really attract to the masculine, whether that's relationships or whether that's success in the outer world or like tangible stuff. What would you want to attract from your feminine attraction if you could attract anything right now, where you are right now? What would it be?
Um, I've never really thought about it. I have seen videos of people talking about using their femininity to attract things, and I just have never felt, because I'm still at the stage where I still feel a little disconnected from it internally,
Mhm.
like not so much my emotions, but the whole sort of concept of um I don't know, like maybe being seen um as a feminine person. I don't know. I still feel like there's some issues there.
Yeah.
But in terms of what I would try to attract and bring in, um, at the moment, I really want, I don't know if this is something you can attract with femininity, but I actually want to attract just like more femininity, like
Yeah,
more
that,
community
that's
and more
perfect.
gentleness
Yeah.
and more people into my life who can be a community for me and be a
Mhm.
family for me.
Yeah.
Um, because I think there's so much of me that really wants a community and really wants a group of people. And I've sort of been, I guess, like deprived of that my whole life. So,
Yeah.
um, what I really want the most in this world is connection to people and open communication with people and like a group of like-minded people to come into my life to sort of become my family on a really soulful level,
Yeah.
who are also on board with being in touch with their femininity and allowing emotions to be, and just kindness. I want to be in a world that's more kind and gentle and be surrounded by that, because a lot of things have been really cold and harsh, and yeah, so if I could bring that in, that would be good.
Yeah, yeah. Amazing, amazing. That was the perfect answer. Your answers are so
They're
profound.
very long
No,
and
not
complex
long.
and
Profound, so profound, so insightful. I can't thank you enough for sharing who you are. And I just want to say, I recognize you, I see you, and I'm listening to every word you're saying. Yeah. So, and I see your spirit and your soul, and it's just so beautiful. Yeah. Yeah.
thank you.
This is the Alexa, Where is My Period 28-day challenge.